Hey guys, EST here, back with a very important video. I've been looking forward to making this since I started my channel. This is what foods effectively last forever, and I consider forever to be like 20, 30 years plus. Because, I mean, if some extremely bad long-term event were to happen, as unlikely as that is compared to just some little 1-month weather thing, you could get like a super garden / borderline farm going within 20 years. Or get real good at hunting rabbits. I don't know, whatever. Supposed to be 20, 30 years, like how old are you right now? Just saying. So just like my Mylar food preservation little mini documentary, which you should definitely watch, I did days worth of research on this, and I found so many sources, just dummy, bulk content blog farms who don't care about their information quality. They were posting inaccurate information, half-truths, stuff that'll be hazardous to you. So I'd steer clear of them, just FYI. You know what? Just use this video as a reference. So a couple things before I jump into the list. First of all, expiration dates, as everybody refers to them, are actually best if used by dates. In fact, I think by law, a lot of them had to stop using the word expiration. Unless they actually truly expire, like they know when it's going to go bad. Now, it could go bad right after the best by date, especially like, dairy products are real sensitive stuff, fruit, whatever. But not necessarily. It usually just means you have to buy it and take it home and maybe freeze it or eat it or whatever. You got 2 weeks after that to eat it with like eggs, for example. So I wouldn't refer to them as expiration dates, but they are the best guideline you have for like a ballpark, but also if you go past them, with some foods it's perfectly okay. Now the other little fact is, yeah, you can make just about any food last forever if you put it in a freeze dryer, but they're like $2,000 to $5,000 for a small one. And then you still need oxygen absorbers to throw in the bags. And speaking of that, in my other video, I showed, you can take dry goods, throw them in a Mylar bag, throw an oxygen absorber in, and ta-da! I mean, you're free of bacteria, fungi, everything. So that's cool, but that's a whole setup, and I think we found out it was like 40 cents to preserve like 70 cents worth of rice or something, which is kind of fine because they're both really cheap, but like, oh, that ratio. So for the definition of this video, it's, what could you basically take in a reasonable container, like a pickle jar? And just pour it in, put the cap on, and leave it. It's airtight-ish, or airtight enough, but no special, desiccants, no special vacuum sealers, no special oxygen absorbers, just, no extra expense. And as expensive as like mason jars are, which they really are, they're well over $1 a piece usually. And they're built for boiling and special sealing and pressure canning and stuff anyway. That's an even bigger expense than Mylar. So, my recommendation is you can always keep, large pill bottles. You can keep pickle jars. You can keep, jelly and jam jars, any kind of glassware. The lids on those close pretty tight, like tight enough that it's not truly airtight, but it's close enough. So something in that type of environment, or maybe just like a ceramic jar with a wax seal. I mean, that's how they used to do it way back in the day. Something that'll reasonably keep the air out. I've even seen at the dollar store, if you saw in my other video, glassware with like little kind of rubber-ish, stopper seals that keep it pretty airtight. You can accumulate these kinds of things for cheap or completely free if it's just, stuff you use, or tell your friends, hey, save all your pickle jars. So this whole list is foods that'll last forever in like a kind of specialized container, but one that you could reasonably get for free. But not just sitting out in the open air, although I will say there are a couple here that would probably qualify. But I mean, you got to keep, bugs and stuff off it anyway. Also, there's one more thing. You might find a food that I say absolutely, by the manufacturer's own word, has no expiration date. Then you get to the store and it has an expiration date, which, like I said, isn't an expiration date. In some places, certain states, counties, countries, stores will not accept a product without a best buy or expiration date, so the manufacturers just make one up. Sometimes they put, realistically, like I saw, freeze-dried stuff at the hardware store that said 2049 on it, right on the bottom. It's not inaccurate, and they weren't kidding, but sometimes grocery stores don't like people playing those games, so they'll just put something 2-3 years in the future. Yeah, you could well ignore it for stuff like, canned Spam, for example. But other times it's the anticipated failure or unsafe chemical breakdown of the container itself. Because as we know, water never goes bad, but that really cheap, thin garbage plastic and lids that they use for cheap water bottles, or I should say bottled water, that actually will degrade in heat, UV, air, anything, and you'll start to taste the plastic in the water, and the water will be contaminated to the point where you shouldn't drink it within the amount of, time that it says on the expiration date, believe it or not. You can always refilter it, but at a certain point, that plastic's just going to degrade and outright fail, believe it or not, and then you'll have water everywhere. So if you're going to buy it off the shelf and leave it as is, make sure it's a glass or metal container. I've seen some pretty tough looking plastic, but if it's some cheapy plastic, very flexible, discolors easily when you hold a lighter up to it, you're going to want to repack it. So sometimes the expiration date does describe the container. Also, if you want to know if almost any, sealed up food is good still, you've got the did it emit more gas test and is it bulging test, which if it is, oh my God, don't eat it, especially canned foods. And then the smell test. Rampant, food breakdown and bacterial, replication, all that, they leave some nasty stuff behind. There are a couple bacteria that will not leave a smell behind at all, but that's extremely uncommon. And your food, if a seal breaks or something goes wrong, there's too much water or whatever got contaminated, it won't be attacked by just one type of bacteria, and one of them in there will smell, probably. And as always, if you're not sure, cook the absolute hell out of it. Also, I should say that going past the Best By date is still generally dangerous. I mean, you can, watch for everything, be real careful. It's still not a good idea in your daily life, mostly for just random foods not found on this list, but even for things found on this list. So all, facts and materials and everything I say in this video is for reference only in an emergency situation. So don't just go saying, oh yeah, this went 5 years past the expiration date, but it's good. But it's like a can and it costs 75 cents. I wouldn't risk it. If you can still go to the store and buy another one for a reasonable price, guess what? Don't risk it. Yes, it's probably safe. You don't want to hear about what happens when probably goes wrong. So all right, that's all the setups and legalese, nonsense, and definitions and everything. Let's jump into the list. So first up, unsurprisingly, it's honey, the one that everybody always references. But unlike all those trash blogs out there, I'm going to explain what type of honey and what can go wrong and how it's treated and what to watch out for. Instead of just, oh, I put honey on the shelf, it's going to last forever. Well, did you buy the right type? Is it treated? Is it, filtered? Is it in a plastic container? Does it have additives? That's why, seriously, you should sub to this channel. You will get the exact details and facts, every single one that you need, not just some blurb and then you do it wrong. So you've probably heard the story that they found 3,000-year-old Egyptian honey and it was still honey and it was still edible. It was in a clay jar. Why is honey so magical? Because bees don't have refrigerators. That is legitimately the reason. So honey has a super, super low water content. It also has a low pH. Nothing really can live inside it because, no water, no oxygen. Plus it has natural antibacterial compounds in it that have never really been adapted to. And on top of that, because bees really like their overkill, there's also a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in it. Not enough to be bad for you, but it's there. So even if it really dries out and becomes crystallized, it's still fine because, that's just, even less water. Great. Now, raw honey, raw untreated honey, which, is the definition of we just took out the honey and poured it in a jar. That's it. Didn't treat it, didn't heat it, didn't filter it, nothing. It can have botulism in it because it's an oxygen-free environment and bees do come in contact with the soil, which is where botulism lives. That's why they say you shouldn't give untreated raw honey, or I think they say any honey just to be paranoid, to like a child under 12 or a pregnant woman because it can cause infant intestinal botulism syndrome or something, which can kill. So the average honey product is pasteurized, which just means they heat it up until nothing in it is alive. And they also usually filter it, but they can get a little nuts with the filtering, with like an ultrafiltration process, which can remove some of the nutrients. People put pollen on the list. I guess they think pollen's good for you, that whole local honey allergy thing. But really, enzymes and antioxidants, those you don't want to filter out. Dead bees and wax solids you do, though. So, filtering isn't all bad, but they can't get nuts with it. But what they're doing is they're trying to make it more pure and thinner and lighter to be more attractive and to pour easier. Other companies just straight up add sugar to it to decrease the costs. So the common wisdom for buying the right type of honey is, one, whatever you can already find in a glass jar would be great, unless you have a glass jar. Because if they bother to use glass, that stuff they know it's going to be shelf stable for basically forever. Glass is heavy, fragile, and expensive. If they bothered to do it, it's because they know what they're doing. And I would just not buy raw honey unless you want to boil it yourself every time you use it, which is like a whole thing. And if you're just going to boil it, then put it in your own container, you might as well just buy pre-pasteurized professionally, honey. So I usually tell people just, one, look for the container type, and two, don't go for some giant megacorp, that says, I don't even know who makes honey, but, some big, huge brand that makes half the stuff in your grocery store. Stay away from them. Read what the label says, but also don't get, raw or unprofessionally made, hand-labeled, I'm a beekeeper and I've got to stand at the organic market type of stuff, because that is a little bit dangerous. So that's all you need to know about honey. Next up, we've got salt, which, A couple items on this list I didn't want to put on this list because they have no calories. Salt has no calories, but it is actually pretty useful. You do need salt to live, and entire wars were fought over salt before. That's right, the whole Roman Empire was just before to me. I mean, it's where the word salary comes from. It's where a warrior worth his salt comes from. They used to pay soldiers in salt. It was so valuable and crucial. It's heavy, and from where you live, where's the closest salt mine? Yeah, you can have all the food you want, and if you don't find some salt, you're in trouble. And this is being said by somebody who lives nowhere near the ocean. So you really got three types of salt. You've got normal iodized that you buy every day, you know, the Morton stuff or whatever. Then you've got the non-iodized. And then you've got salt that's still labeled salt, but is not sodium chloride. It's like potassium chloride. And I think they use that for melting ice on roads and stuff. Yeah, just because it says it's salt and it tastes salty doesn't mean it's actually sodium based. It usually is. It might be a mix. I heard conflicting reports, but there are like potassium based salts out there. Yeah, you don't need that. And then whenever you read like, oh, pink Himalayan salt, that's just salt with like glorified contaminants in it. It's just salt plus. I mean, I kind of equate it to like garlic salt. Oh, it's salt with garlic powder in it. Cool. So just buy salt. In fact, buy non-iodized salt, which is a little bit harder to find. It's there. I mean, I had to go to my local hardware store to find it. That was weird. But you know, 50 cents for like, I don't know, a pound, half a pound or something. It's pretty cheap. And it keeps pretty much forever, but humid air can cause it to clump up, but that's fine. If it gets all, you know, crystallized and clumped up, you can just take a hammer, break it, and it's still fine. The like laminated paper containers are pretty bad though. And they use them because they know they'll last a couple years, and that's, you know, they have an expiration date, and there you go. And once again, it's the expiration date of the materials. It's the package that will expire. But yeah, salt, I mean, if you keep it out of just humidity, that's it. You don't need an oxygen-free environment. It's fine under ultraviolet light. It's fine with heat. So you just throw that in a, you know, jelly jar, a pickle jar, whatever, and close the lid. That's enough to keep, you know, the water vapors out. So iodized salt, you will find that as most table salt, almost everything you buy is iodized because that's how humans get enough iodine in their system, which is a critical thing you need for your thyroid. It's hard to get it from other sources, really. I think it's in like exotic organ meats that nobody eats anymore, and just it's nowhere else in your diet, so they put it in the salt. So you do need it. So I would and did store a little bit of iodized salt, but usually it goes bad in about 5 years because the iodine is fine. That's like literally an atomic component, like it's an element. There's nothing to break down. It's not a molecule, but they use anti-caking agents and some other stuff to like stick the iodine to the salt, and that can break down. I couldn't find any information about what it breaks down into. I think the worst I saw was people said it might have a bit of a smell to it. It would obviously still contain iodine because where would it go? But it could very well break down into a very unfriendly compound. Hard to say really, but everybody says if you're going to store salt, just don't get the iodine stuff. But also you need iodine, so do get the iodine stuff. Just mark it as, 5 years. One more thing is if you want to make absolutely sure that this isn't some weird salt mix or some kind of like sea salt, combination, just check the ingredients. It should literally just say salt. Next up, another one that I really didn't want to put on the list, but I knew some of you would be crushed if I didn't. It's instant coffee. There's about 10 reasons that this shouldn't be on the list, to be honest, but caffeine can be important in a survival environment. So we're not talking real whole beans. Those don't work. So instant coffee is like pre-dried. They sort of make coffee and then evaporate it back into powder. And sometimes what they use is a freeze-drying method inside of a large freeze dryer, a commercial-sized one, which, you could freeze-dry a chicken wing and it would be fine. So freeze-drying is cheating, as I said, but okay, some of them use air blasting at normal atmospheric pressure. It usually results in a near zero water content, which is just what you need to be safe, basically. So the freeze-drying method, though, it will preserve 97% of the nutrients and calories, but coffee has no significant calories, which if it doesn't have calories, why are you bothering? But if you really like coffee, whatever. So the best way to store it is actually in the original container. They're usually pretty good containers. They're real cheap, thin plastic stuff, I don't know, but a lot of them come in metal containers. I would definitely look for that. So the one thing to watch out for is everybody does this differently. So you can't just say that across the board instant coffee will last forever. Sometimes they can put oils on it to keep the water out or to keep the oxygen off to preserve the flavor, and those can break down and grow mold. So this isn't guaranteed safe, it's brand dependent, and I don't have a list of safe brands, which is another reason I didn't want this on the list. But like I said, some people really like their coffee. Just fun fact, caffeine pills have virtually an eternal shelf life. So anyway, yeah, nothing's guaranteed. The best you can do is, look for a sturdy metal tin or whatever, and then maybe read on the label, like what method they used, if it was freeze drying or not. I mean, they might say it. And the other thing is, people said that, yeah, it's fine, it's safe after, 10, 20 years or whatever, but it has a bit of a odd taste to it. Stack that with the, maybe you don't have sugar and definitely don't have dairy to put in it. I would just skip it. Next up, I didn't realize I front-loaded all the really dumb ones. Alcohol, hard liquor specifically. Not many calories. It's dangerous to be drunk in emergency situations. It's not a proper way of coping with your problems. Yeah, it's temporary escapism, but in a long-term scenario, not having your wits about you is incredibly stupid. And you're much more likely to injure yourself or do something idiotic or break something while you're drunk. So I don't agree with this at all, but it was on the list, and this is a comprehensive list. Also can be used for, medical uses, but also medical alcohol is cheaper, smarter, and easier. Like that 91% rubbing alcohol, you can get that way cheaper. And this is a bit of a minefield. People just, like to say, oh, alcohol lasts forever. Except when it has fruit additives, except when it has cream additives, except when it has any additives. You basically need it to be a pure alcoholic beverage. So, I mean, boy, you might run into one where it went bad regardless because they added something to it, and there are additives in tons and tons of hard liquors these days. And they're pretty expensive for something that has no calories, just saying. I would invest in like dried chamomile leaves or seeds to grow them yourself or something, or other, calming dried or freeze-dried herbs to like de-stress in a stressful environment. It's just safer and it's better for your liver. So you actually, if you're going to do this, you need 25% alcohol or higher, but you actually want it a lot higher since the alcohol molecule can break down over time. So you want it to never reach below 25%. And the proof system is just the percentage but doubled. So if it's 50 proof, it's 25% alcohol. So if it were to drop below 25%, you can be in trouble of bacteria and yeast even if it's still sealed because they're already in it. Also, ultraviolet light is the enemy of any kind of alcoholic beverage. So you almost need to like spray paint the cans black or something, or the bottles, or keep them behind like cardboard or something. I mean, you just can't leave them out in the light, not for, year after year after year. Now, they're fairly heat stable. In fact, it's a complete and utter myth that alcohol, quote, cooks off when you like throw it in your, stir fry or your bread or whatever. Usually 10 to 20% of it will cook off if it's an extremely long cook time. And that's at like 400 degrees. So that just simply is a myth that alcohol breaks down under heat, unless you literally light it on fire. But ultraviolet light, if it breaks it down, it turns it into vinaigre. You might have heard of it. Vinegar. Also sour wine in French. That's where it comes from. And having tasty vinegar in your hard liquor is... oh. So a lot of people say, hey, even if you don't drink yourself, which would be me. I know, 33-year-old German guy in Wisconsin and I don't drink. People say, well, it's a trade item. Yeah. I mean, to some alcoholic. Yeah, cigarettes are a trade item too. Good luck storing those. Trading is inherently dangerous, and somebody who knows that you got a big stockpile of stuff or suspects it, that's not good. You should just have what you have and leave it at that. So anyway, speaking of vinegar, the next one on the list is vinegar. It's another one that isn't technically a food. You can put it on food to make it taste better. It's kind of good for you in small amounts. It can be used for cooking. It can be used for cleaning. Bleach is better and safer, though. It's basically just water and acid, and nothing can live in that. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. White distilled is the best. Other types actually can go bad. And even with white distilled, if it changes slightly in color or starts to form sediment on the bottom, that's fine. That just was in it. You can still, give it a smell. If it smells absolutely offensive besides the smell of vinegar, then I wouldn't touch it. That usually means something got in it, but... I mean, you could almost just pour sugar in it and there's so much acid, bacteria would just die. So that was a really easy one. Next up, we're going to get into the real stuff. Okay, so the big issue with, meats and pastas, even bean dishes, is like everybody knows cooking oil goes bad, and it goes bad quick. Like even vegetable oil, 6 months to a year, like after the Best Buy date, tops. In those cases, honestly, I would just go by the Best Buy dates. It goes bad in a hurry. So like if you're going to store popcorn, well, how are you going to pop it? Oh, you stored pasta. What are you going to put on it? Well, there is one oil and really only one oil that will last forever, and luckily it's pretty tasty and very healthy. It is virgin coconut oil. So almost all other oils, the molecules break down. In fact, just the oil inside of like walnuts breaks down and the walnuts go bad. Oil is just really, really, really hard to store. The oil or what it breaks down into, either one, can be eaten by bacteria. So then you've got, okay, what's healthy and what's not, which in a survival scenario, who cares? But I mean, you're talking heart and artery health, not just like, oh, I ate some calories today. So yeah, you're probably getting good cardio in case, the world ends. But basically, the unhealthy, highly saturated, which means more hydrogen on the side of the oil chain molecules, those are thicker and they have a longer shelf life and higher smoke points, which means, they don't turn into smoke in your pan as easily and, go nasty and taste bad and evaporate. Not to mention set off your smoke alarm. So you probably have heard of, extra virgin olive oil. Well, what does that term even mean? It means it was not separated from its like other components using chemicals or high temperatures. That's all it means. So it means it was just straight filtered. High temperatures can damage the oil. They can ruin its shelf life. They can make it taste different. And, using weird stripping chemicals to like separate out certain stuff, that's not always good. It can, mess with the oil, do funny stuff to it, break down parts of the oil. So that's considered processed oil. And then virgin oil means they didn't do it that way. And then extra virgin is just like a higher certification, but it's almost exclusively for olive oils. Now, coconut oil is like a paste. It's a pretty darn, high saturated one, but it's actually not that unhealthy. So what I ended up picking up really recently was a whole jar of it. It's actually 56 fluid ounces. I mean, that's 1.75 quarts, 1.66 liters, so quite a lot of it. Pretty sure I just bumped into the mic, so now you can hear how heavy it is. But I'm pretty sure this is under $10. Which is, not bad for a coconut product. I mean, you got to ship that in from a ways away. So when it comes to this, virgin is good, extra virgin is better, and unrefined is even better. That is the best. So refining it in any way makes it more susceptible to being ruined by oxygen. So if you've got it in a, an airtight container like the one it came in, for example, there's only a tiny amount of oxygen, that's fine. You feel free to go, package it somewhere in a mason jar with an oxygen absorber, or just buy unrefined stuff. So I actually got this one at Sam's Club. So it's a Members Mark brand. It's organic virgin coconut oil, cold pressed and unrefined. So that is absolute top tier. Also, the jar it's in is plastic. In fact, it's specifically PETE it's labeled, which is polyethylene terephthalate. So it can break down in the presence of oxygen, but not too quickly. And this is so thick and so brittle of a material. This isn't your typical flexible plastic. I'd feel pretty safe just covering this in like a paper bag to keep the ultraviolet light off the plastic and the oil, and keeping it this way forever. I mean, if you want to be really safe, throw it inside of a glass jar and put the top on. So this one just under half a gallon jar is 14,300 calories. That's the other thing to consider. So you can cook anything, you can make it more flavorful. There's always a little bit of a coconut flavor in there, but if you've ever had coconut shrimp, that's not a big problem. I would store quite a bit of this because cooking oils and oils in general are so unbelievably important. They can help your diet. They're solid, high density calories. They're a source of enormous energy. I mean, it's so important. Next up, another one that technically has no calories, but I wanted to throw it in because it's one of my favorites. It's soy sauce. But only traditionally brewed soy sauce. It must say traditionally brewed on it, because that means that in addition to the enormous amount of salt, it also has a small amount of alcohol in it. You'll be able to tell if it's actually traditionally brewed because they will traditionally put it in a glass bottle because they know it'll last forever. You've probably seen them on restaurant tables with no refrigeration, and that's because, honestly, soy sauce only lasts forever if it's unopened, but even if it's opened, you can get at least 6 months out of it in just the open air, and refrigeration adds about 2 years to that. So restaurants know within 6 months it'll be used up, obviously, because, it's tasty, so they're fine. But, if you get one marked traditionally brewed, it's in a glass bottle, you're good. The only thing you got to worry about is like the plastic breaking down on the top, or the cap, I should say. But even then, you've usually got like a very thoroughly glued on seal as well. So you should be fine either way, and you can put this on anything, especially considering the volume of rice that I have. If you've ever had plain rice, you know how unbelievably boring and like food fatigued you can get from eating it all the time. And, it's not like you necessarily have a whole bunch of, different herbs and stuff to throw in or flavorings. You can make patties out of it with cooking oil, though, coconut oil, just saying. But still, you add soy sauce and it's just infinitely better. I feel like I could eat that every day for the rest of my life. It's probably not true, but The closer you can get to that, the better. So I've got about a dozen bottles just sitting around. I mean, it is kind of expensive. Usually it's like, what, $3.50 a bottle, but it'll last forever. I mean, in the next 30 years, I'm going to eat it regardless. I just keep cycling, and every time I run out, I grab a new one from my storage and then replace it. So the amount of like rotating oxygen coming through an opened container will make it slightly darken, but that actually means it's improving in flavor, believe it or not. Or it's actually improving in quality, then it starts to go downhill. So if it changed in color because you left it out for a while and your refrigerator has no electricity or whatever, don't immediately assume it went bad. It actually went good. Next up on the list, we've got dry beans, and it's basically most types. They are extremely dry, like 8 to 9% water by volume, I think? Might be by weight, I don't remember, for pintos. I mean, they're basically built to be a hard shell, like a container that resists water. It lets a little bit of water in, though, because that's how the seeds germinate, because, remember, they're literally seeds. And they're built to maintain the important, protein, nutrients, and everything on the inside, because when the plant, the seed germinates, the plant needs those. Now, that said, as tough as most seeds are, I mean, I've heard of seeds that they found, once again, in an Egyptian tomb. They're finding all kinds of stuff in Egyptian tombs this video. They found some ancient wheat seeds, some kind of grain that's like a wheat variant, and they planted it and got it to germinate, but the germination rate was crap. And that's how it goes. I mean, if you've got gardening seeds for like some flower, some cucumber, whatever, and they're 4 years old, you'll be lucky to get like a 10% germination rate, depending upon how they were stored in their initial quality. So it does go down over time. It's not perfect. Remember, seeds are only really designed by nature to last 1, maybe 2 years. It's really just the season change. They just go in the ground, land somewhere, and then when the, liquid water comes out and the snow goes away, there you go, it goes. So you really want to keep them away from water, especially just water vapor in the air, which means, pickle jar, put on the top, ta-da. And then you've got a much better improved version of nature's natural nutrient storage device. So beans over 30 years old were tested by a university, and they were still in nearly perfect nutritional content. And the couple people they fed them to said they were moderately okay on taste. I think like 80% of the people said, yeah, these taste just fine, and 20% are like, these are a little duller. So for 30 years, I mean, that's pretty good. The thing is, though, they can like kind of dry out more, and they can take longer to cook. Which, if you know pinto beans, they already take forever to cook. Usually just got to soak them in water for like 8 hours. And sometimes they'll just never get as soft as they would have if they were, less than a year old. And they could be a little bit harder in your digestive system, which, beans are already a little bit hard on your digestive system. But you could just pre-soak them longer, or you can pre-soak them at all if they're a bean where you wouldn't normally do that before cooking them. And if you really want to help break down like the planty parts, the hard parts, you can actually put a little bit of baking soda in the water. Speaking of that, baking soda is shelf stable forever, but not in the paper boxes it comes in. Put it in literally anything else that's airtight. So, as much as I threw, pinto beans out there in the Mylar food preservation video and said, yeah, here's the weights, here's what it looks like, all that stuff. You technically don't need to throw it in Mylar with an oxygen absorber. You could just throw it in the Mylar without the oxygen absorber. They're so dry, it doesn't matter if there's oxygen or not. I'd be still a little leery if I packaged them on an extremely high humidity day, though. Because then you're going to have water and oxygen trapped in the bag. That's not the greatest idea. And as cheap as Mylar is, I'd still throw dry beans in it, as well as rice and anything else. But if you want to go the absolute cheapest route, where, like I said, pickle jars are basically free, just throw it in a pickle jar and ta-da. The problem is, you're going to want to store like 20, 30, 40 pounds of pinto beans or something, because they're the biggest source of amino acids that you need to substitute basically meat in your diet, which may not be as easy to come by. So you're going to want a fairly large volume of them, even if, you're not a big pinto bean fan right now. So the point is, you're going to need a lot of jars. Maybe you can go to the thrift store, get some, secondhand Tupperware. I think that stuff's supposed to be pretty oxygen-free, but it doesn't have a true seal. But yeah, I mean, Mylar bags, you can buy them like by the gallon for like a couple cents. I would just do it that way. Now, comparatively, how many pounds of salt do you really need in a year? So get a couple jars, there's your salt. So next up on the list, everybody's favorite, Spam and other canned meats. Now this, once again, gets very complicated. There are some do's and some do-nots that are not typically stated as the warnings that they should be in other articles. In fact, I think I just found the most misinformation about this category widespread across the internet. So let's talk about Spam. It was originally designed for war. I believe it was in the 30s. I believe it was World War II. So they wanted canned meats that are, pressure canned at temperatures that can kill the botulism spores themselves, which you cannot do in boiling water. It doesn't get hot enough. It's about 30 degrees away. So what they do is they put it in a pressure container where steam builds up pressure, and then because it's higher than atmospheric pressure, the boiling point of water goes up. And then water boils at, 250, 260, 270 degrees. And about 250 is what you need to kill the botulinum spores. Well, just about all canned food in America right now is pressure canned. I prefer the term pressure cooked. But, do they cook it long enough to kill botulinum? Or do they just say, you know what, it's so low in botulinum that, we sanitize it other ways. We're just going to put a 2-year expiration date on it and call it a day and cook it for the ideal amount of time to cook the contents. And that's why, they say those real thin packets of tuna that are, I think, just layered aluminum and Mylar, they always taste better than canned because the cans are so thick that to cook the tuna properly, to a safe temperature to kill all the pathogens, because fish are quite dangerous, and anything underwater equals, a million times more botulism, they have to overcook the tuna because it's just such a risk of botulism. Now you look at like green beans, it's soil adjacent. They usually run them in an ammonia bath. And you know that if you overcook beans, they just turn into mushy nothing. So, sliced green beans, I would not eat them past their expiration date. Also, an entire can of green beans is like 90 calories. Little hint for what not to buy. So what's the botulism risk in beef? Well, I mean, lower. They're not a sea creature, so if you buy some, canned meat, how do you know that they cooked it for long enough to prevent botulism? And the answer is, well, if you leave it on the shelf for 10 years and it starts bulging because the botulism bacteria emits a gas that will make it swell up, well, what if you're not quite to that point? It takes a while. What if it's not quite swelled up, but you had a botulism colony absolutely go run away crazy? Well, then you've got the botulinum toxin in there, no sign of it, and also it has no scent. So you'd have to take your already cooked meats, and if you don't trust them, which you shouldn't, then, well, you gotta, reboil them again or get them, because boiling them in water for about 8 minutes will kill the botulinum toxin, but not the spore. So as long as you eat it within, I think it's like 12 hours, you should be fine. But recooking already cooked meats that were already cooked extremely at high temperatures with pressure canning, oh boy. And then, you need the energy. Then, well, do you have control over the heat all that well, over a campfire as opposed to like with full electricity and amenities? So that's why I would say don't just say, oh, look, here's some canned chicken. Cool, throw it on the shelf for 30 years. However, the Spam company, specifically, Hormel or whatever, the makers of Spam, they stand by the fact that their product has no expiration date. They are 100% sure that the way, the temperature, the methods that they cook it, and the material that the can is made out of are tough enough to last indefinitely. And this has been verified by military tests. Because remember, it was a military product. So these tend to be laminated on the inside, which is why they got to be careful how hot they get it. So it's some kind of polymer coating, some kind of, hopefully these days BPA free, unless you buy it from another country, can. And that keeps the metal from oxidizing, and then they can use a cheaper metal. Well, that's one really good reason not to buy ones that are dented or folded or dinged or anything, because they might have put a little break in the laminate and boom, you got a rust spot, and then it's going to get gases on the inside, get oxygen, and bacteria are going to go bonkers. So do not buy damaged cans. So the outside also tends to be a really tough metal that doesn't oxidize easily, not necessarily the inner layers, unless they just make the whole thing out of like aluminum or tin, but that's pretty expensive. I've seen cans that are just like laminated steel and that's it. That's not a good idea. It's not stainless. Stainless costs like 50 times more. Or at least at the scrap dealer it does. So other brands that look like Spam, who knows? Who knows what they're doing? They're usually cheaper. I wouldn't trust them. So the average can of Spam, the stuff I buy, is 1,080 calories per $3. So that's up there, but, meat could be considered a very useful part of your diet, obviously, with all the amino acid chains and unique proteins, which what I said is just highly redundant. But, it'd be nice to just mix some meat in with your rice or noodles once in a while, just to keep your protein levels up, and if you're sick of beans. I mean, at the end of the day, meat is delicious. Can't deny that. So whatever your budget allows for, if you're sitting on 50 cans, good for you. I'm sitting on about 10. So these are a lot cheaper than purpose canned meat, which I'll get to that in a second. But I have a little bit of a low confidence in the new Pop Tops because it's literally a weakness built into the metal on the top to help you open it. It's one giant like circular weak point. I had heard from some sources that Pop Tops like that are you can go 2 to 5 years past the date safely, and then past that, But other people insist that they're careful enough that even these days there just is no expiration date. And I checked, what I bought doesn't have an expiration date. So, they seem to be saying, no, we've got a solid pop top technology. And if you ever tried to pop the top on them, it's some thick metal still. So I'll take their word for it when they're one of the few companies that can come forward and say, hey, this will last basically forever. So if you're ever unsure about something, you've got a big batch that was all produced, 10, 15 years ago, and you're in an emergency scenario, I hate to say it, but here's what you do. You find a wild animal and cage it, or a family pet, or a stray that hangs around, and you feed it to them first. If they become paralyzed and die, it has botulinum in it. Like I said, this whole video you really shouldn't do unless there's an absolute critical emergency ongoing situation. I'm pretty sure feeding potentially bad food to an animal to see if it dies is illegal in all 50 states, but not if there's like an absolute crazy, meltdown level emergency. And like I said, you can always reheat it. I mean, Spam is pretty well cooked, but it's also kind of like processed. It doesn't cook like normal meat. So if you just get it up to, real good high temperature for, about 8 minutes, you should be fine. And if there is botulism, you should be able to see the gases from it, and you're going to smell it if there's a breach in the can. Now, what about purpose canned meats that I mentioned? Well, they're in ultra thick, there's some nickname for it. I think they're called like number 10 cans or something, but then they go even past that. It's like a standard for thickness and all that, but they will say 25-year shelf life on some of them that I looked at. What they do is they put the meat in with a different like internal mixture with different amounts of water, tougher metals, like I said, in the walls, more pure metals, and the way they cook it is very specific, very professional. And then they take them out, a year later and test them, and they take them out 3 years later and test them in a lab. So like these are the people where they're making purpose-made canned meats that are supposed to have a ridiculous shelf life. They're like survival foods, basically. I would rather just for weight reasons get freeze-dried, because all you got to do is just soak it in water and boom, you got meat. And people said, in all likelihood, you can't tell the difference. It's about the equivalent of fresh, never frozen ground beef versus frozen ground beef. You can barely taste the difference. So, I mean, why have a big, 5-10 pound jar of meat that you got professionally canned and, basically pre-cooked, when you could have it in thin, light Mylar bags with all the water removed, which is the majority of the weight, and just, here's my meat. And technically, that'll store forever, whereas, the cans, you only get 25 years out of them, and you still kind of want to keep the cans away from water just in case. And the risk of botulism when the freeze dryer leaves like 1% water behind is 0. But, freeze-dried meat is extremely expensive, but these, 25-year shelf life canned meats are also extremely expensive. It's usually like $30 to $40 a can for like a couple pounds of meat inside. That's pretty bad. I mean, they're kind of ripping you off on the high margin there. Like, I get it, it's safety, they put all the science into it. I still don't see it. To me, they should be about half that price, because I know what beef costs in bulk, and I know what the cans cost, and I know what the process costs. And also, let me just say, there's 1,000,001 different companies out there making long, shelf life meat. You got to take their word for them, that they're not just some new fly-by-night company. They're not just some rebranded stuff. They're not from outside the U.S. and just dodging all kinds of certifications. So, yeah, you can buy it. But like I said, I would just stick to Spam, or stick to ones that I guess people have reviewed well, but people would have to keep the can for 10 years, pop it open, and then not die. And if they did die from it, they aren't leaving a review. So like I said, you're really buying it based on the company's, assurances. So next up, loose dried popcorn. Microwavable popcorn packets, they have salt, but there's also oil, and it's not enough salt to save the oil from being broken down and turning rancid from bacteria and oxygen. So those are out, but, well, your microwave doesn't work anyway after the apocalypse. So loose kernels are just barely over the 10% water, which is considered the safe limit for Mylar food, foil storage. But that water limit is only for botulism, which, like I said, comfortably needs about 30% water to replicate in. And, seeds are kind of just like little containers with like really tight barriers around them. So they don't tend to get botulinum spores on the inside where the water is. So the key is really to just keep the kernels away from extremely high temperatures, UV, and especially water. The worst you'll get from really, really old popcorn that was properly stored in, just an airtight container of any type is a lower pop rate. But here's the thing, you also need oil to pop them. So coconut oil is like the preferred way to cook popcorn, by the way, according to like everybody I ever talked to. So if you haven't tried that, do it. It's amazing. And as mentioned in this video, organic, virgin, cold-pressed, unrefined coconut oil. Yes, I'm just reading it from next to me again. That's what you want to get. So if you do get a worse pop rate, it's because the steam, or like the water on the inside of the kernel turns into steam and causes it to, under pressure, pop out. So if even more of that water slowly escaped because the shells are a little tiny bit porous, you can actually take like 1 cup of dried kernels, throw them in like a Ziploc bag or a container, peanut butter jar or whatever, an empty peanut butter jar, and then put 1 tablespoon of water in it, and then just shake it up until the water disappears. That means it's been absorbed into the kernels, and then you can pop them and you'll get a way better result. And I believe you can also, if you had the right equipment, grind them into like corn flour, corn starch, corn, whatever, something to cook with. I'm not that big on baking and cooking. Hey, speaking of that though, corn starch and corn syrup. Just because of the nature of starch, it's safe practically forever if you keep it dry. The syrup also lasts forever because of its water content, or lack thereof, I should say. One manufacturer, I'm not going to name them in case they've recanted this since then, but they said that even if their bottle of corn syrup has been opened, it's so stable and so pure that it just won't be attacked by bacteria or even mold, and it should be fine indefinitely. He basically told everybody, with the quality and the way that we do it, we don't break it down, we don't mess with it. It's just pure syrup. It just cannot be attacked by bacteria. So it should be fine indefinitely, even just like literally sitting in the open air. I mean, besides like dust and ultraviolet getting to it, I guess. Not to mention the plastic container, always watch out for that. Cheap, generic food grade plastic breaks down a lot quicker than you think. So corn syrup is not really used much anymore. Same with molasses. People just don't cook with it like they used to. But it's basically used to sweeten baked goods. So you would typically put it in like cookies or something. But people just use, sugar now. But cornstarch, that's a pretty big, baking thing. You should be able to make like a breading out of it if you wanted to make like breaded chicken dipped in delicious coconut oil. It's hard to make deep fried foods without being able to control the temperature of like a fire that you're cooking over though. So if you know something famous you can do and you've tested it out ahead of time with cornstarch or corn syrup, then I'd say, pack it up. Otherwise, if you're like, oh, I've got all this and I don't really know what to do with it, I'd skip it. Next up is maple syrup. So bees don't have refrigerators, but neither do trees. So they got to keep their sugars that they use to grow and, do whatever else. They got to keep that from, being attacked by random bacteria that can get inside of them. So they develop maple syrup. So it's pretty much good forever. Now, if you do open it and you just like leave it in, mostly the open air, occasionally opening it to use it, you can only use it for about a year, and that's with refrigeration preferred. And once again, you do want to buy pure maple syrup, not like processed or, any kind of, bulk maple syrup product. A lot of people, they like to change the flavor. They like to add stuff. They add sugar. They add preservatives, which, is nice. Okay, cool. But pure is still the best. It's the better option, and it lasts a lot longer, especially in the open air after being opened. So it might change in taste and quality slightly over time, but the bacteria that it would attack the sugars tend to give a noticeable smell and taste. But they also usually require oxygen, and because it's a syrup, it's like a liquid. It's so thick that it's hard to get, oxygen, plus it's a very low water content as well. Also, if you buy very pure maple syrup and then it got it on the shelf for 10 years and then you see that there's some things that settled in the bottom, that's just, random tree parts and whatever, it's still fine. So get this, even though it's basically inside of itself oxygen-free, it's too little water for botulism to replicate. And honestly, they usually boil the syrup anyway to process it, and sometimes they even boil it at pressure just to be absolutely safe. So it's basically safe from everything. I would buy, like, once again, the kind of off-brand, not the bulk produce, whatever. I've heard of that company, some, I don't know what, General Mills or something. I don't know who makes syrup. I don't know, some megacorp like Nestle. Like, I would avoid that because it's going to be some hyper-processed maple adjacent product. But also, I wouldn't buy pure unrefined because they haven't even pasteurized it, so I'd get somewhere in the middle there. Some little side, small off-brand, maybe something made on a medium scale in your own state or something like that. Also, definitely look for a glass bottle since it's so easy to store it in its own sealed bottle. You don't want the plastic to be the first thing that fails. Next up, just straight up sugar, granulated sugar or powdered sugar actually. So while bacteria do like sugar, they also need water to live. So when you buy it, everybody knows it comes in those crappy little laminated paper bags. Those are not good enough for long-term storage, not even close. Half the time, if you find one on the shelf, you can kind of squeeze it a little bit. It'll have hardened into, crystallized stuff because it let too much water in. It's an unbelievably cheap way to package it. You have to repackage it. Just FYI, even if you're not going to store it too long, it can absorb funny flavors from other things you're cooking in your kitchen through the paper. So, onion ramen sugar, yum. So the sugar crystals are literally a crystal, so they have practically zero water in the crystalline structure. I will say though, brown sugar, no. It has too much water. It is extremely hazardous. It is susceptible to everything. So brown sugar is a no-no under any circumstance. There's one way you can preserve it correctly if you're the biggest brown sugar fan in the world, and that's to put it in like an absolutely like hermetically sealed, crazy, flawless container, and then having it blasted at a radiation lab with like an ungodly amount of rads to kill everything living inside of it. So, oh yes, there's another tier. There's open air. There's, okay, I put it in a jar and put the lid on. Then there's, okay, I put it in a bag or a jar and put an oxygen absorber and a desiccant in it. And then there's like freeze dried where it's like, okay, now we've gone crazy. And then there's put it in a sealed container and blast the holy bejesus out of it with radiation, killing every single last individual cell in it. Which, by the way, can start to affect the food quality a little bit. And yes, it is safe. You're blasting it with the radiation, not like exposing it to a radioactive material, like a powder, or like radioactive dirt. But I'm not even going to get into what that costs because let's just say that the industry has moved towards freeze drying. Also, ignorant people think that radiation is scary. I will call out though, a long time ago, if you saw this on Mythbusters, they did this to chips for the double dipping thing. They needed chips that had absolutely no bacteria on them whatsoever, and they couldn't find one off the shelf clean enough. And so they took a bag of chips and just blasted it in a radiation, gun thing. And it was at a facility that, like, for medical use makes, like, you send in something, they'll blast it, and there you go. Now it has zero bacteria in it for just, like, a baseline control test. I'm sure it's a couple $1,000s, though. I just thought it was interesting that that's another method of food preservation. It's just not realistic. But other than that, brown sugar is out. Powdered sugar is in because it's just a crushed form of the crystal, basically. It's still plenty dry. It doesn't have enough water. So, once again, if the sugar starts to clump up a little bit, that's fine. It just means that there was, the tiniest, faintest amount of water in there initially. But here's the thing. If one single bacteria cell lands on the surface of a sugar crystal, it immediately dies because the material is so aggressive at absorbing water. I think it's called like hydroscopic or something like that it pulls the water out of the bacteria cell and kills it instantly from dehydration. And that's why the sugar kind of tends to group up a little bit, but it's like, it is its own natural desiccant, which is a material that absorbs water. So yeah, any airtight container, that'll do it. I should say absorbed water, if you have too much of it, especially just from the atmosphere, from humidity, which is why you want it airtight, it will cause mold to grow on the sugar eventually. So you do have to watch that. You can't just, store it out in the open and who cares. Next up on the list, multivitamins. Okay, once again, no calories in this, but you need everything else in there to live, so it's not all about calories. So some compounds may break down over time to make them less useful, but not most of them. Remember, it's called a vitamin and mineral multivitamin. Minerals tend to be very, very stable. Basically, if you keep them out of the open air and you don't get them wet, they're usually good for about 15 years or more. So not forever, but, 15 years. And that's, once again, coming from a U.S. military study because they needed to know, for long-term storage what they can do. They're out there making MREs. They're out there stocking bunkers. They got to know what's what. And they said 90 to 100% of the pills can survive. Now, other exacting supplements, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Like fish oils, you would absolutely never want to store them that way. Remember, oils are dangerous. So like if you bought just vitamin C, it should be fine, I guess. I mean, that's one of the molecules where it's kind of sensitive. You don't want to get it hot. But in general, I mean, why not just get a multivitamin? It has everything in it. And they are dirt cheap, especially at like the big bulk stores like, Sam's Club, Costco, Gordon's. Actually, Gordon's doesn't sell them. Or even just like online, you can find like 1,000 pills or 500 pills together online. And they're a lot cheaper than they used to be. So, and the best way to store them is typically in their original container. It tends to be pretty decent plastic. I mean, if you got a jar, throw them in a jar, but the plastic is opaque and keeps light out, and ultraviolet light will attack a lot of the compounds inside of multivitamins, although they are packed inside of like an opaque white powder material, pill filler. I think the ideal way to do it is inside of Mylar and oxygen absorb it, or put them in like a glass jar and then, cover the glass jar in a brown paper bag or whatever, just to be sure, because oxygen does like to destroy some things, but the pills are also, they have like a pretty thick outer coating, so like they said, 15 years or more in its original container with no special oxygen absorbing or nothing, it's fine. And the worst that they found was, oh, well, this contains a little bit less, vitamin A now or whatever. I will say, though, in the original container, it's already absolutely airtight, and it usually already contains a desiccant because water will wreck the pills. Just the material the pills are built out of. Personally, I accidentally mixed up some bottles and it was not put back right when I moved, so I took some 7 years past expiration date multivitamins, and I was fine. And those were already opened. They said basically if you check the pills and they look physically fine, there's no discoloration or mold, they're still good. But I wouldn't recommend that in, daily life, just saying. Once again, only take it 7 years past the expiration if it's an emergency or, in my case, an accident, but avoid that. Another one that just barely made the list is pure vanilla extract. I mean, but like, why? It has no calories. It smells nice, but it doesn't even, taste that good. It only really tastes, all that good in, like, baked goods like cookies and only in tiny amounts. So I guess if you wanted to spice that up, but who the hell's making cookies? It isn't the best survival food, but I thought, well, it technically does last forever, so I'll put it on the list. I've never tried putting it on pasta or rice, so I might be missing out on a whole thing here. But one thing I should mention, obviously, glass bottle. Make sure it's pure vanilla, not imitation vanilla, not a mix, because the other stuff will break down really quick. And never, ever, ever refrigerate it, open or otherwise. It will destroy the contents getting it that cold, believe it or not. So it has to be room temperature. Most people don't know that, actually. So that's it for the eternal foods, believe it or not. Now we're going to move on to the couple that I don't really recommend for various reasons. Either they are a myth and will not last that long, or there's just other extraneous details that will make you not want to go towards them as an option. So first up, we got pasta, ramen noodles, and white rice. So in other words, just dried goods that you put in water and make delicious. Now, what's wrong with those? They're just fine. You throw them in a glass jar and put the lid on. They will last basically forever. Why are they on my almost list? It's because they're so big and heavy and such common staples. They're where you're going to get most of your calories. So where the heck are you going to get that many jars? Just put them in Mylar and put the oxygen absorbers in it. You'll get even more time out of them. It'll be even safer. And it's just a better way to store them. I mean, if you think about it, I could get away cheap with 1 gallon freezer bags. Well, freezer bags aren't airtight. Okay, I'll put them in pickle jars. Well, you're going to get about 1 meal worth of rice in a pickle jar. So now you need 100 pickle jars, and where are you going to store them all? And then what if something happens to the shelf? The shelf collapses. Well, then they all break. When it comes to white rice, noodles, or pasta, just put them in Mylar. Don't try to preserve them any other way. It's just so easy. Now that said, I mean, you boil them anyway, so, botulinum, whatever, but there's not enough water in any of these. The big thing is insect eggs. They can sneak into, rice and beans and that kind of stuff. And then if they hatch, then you've got a problem. So to avoid that, you could just, put them in Mylar with an oxygen absorber, or you can freeze them for 3 days and then take them out of the freezer, then you're good. But that causes water condensation. So if it's just a bag of rice, well, maybe that's not an airtight bag. So it's like, when it comes right down to it, just put it in Mylar. And put it in Mylar with oxygen absorbers, because that's the proper way to do it and how to kind of shrink pack them smaller anyway. Next up, we got bouillon cubes, which you use to make like chicken broth. The package says about 2 years. They may contain fats and oils, but they have so much salt in them that it preserves them for quite a while. But no sources online that I checked actually gave an actual number or a example of somebody testing this. So because of the oils that make, chicken broth, I'd stay away, because I think, no matter how much salt there is, you might still have the oils break down in the presence of oxygen. And some bacteria might be able to start to get at it. I don't trust it. People seem to say that in theory, if it doesn't taste unusual and doesn't have any visible mold on it, then, and it didn't change texture or color significantly, it should be fine. And plus, you literally boil it in water, so it'll kill everything. But to me, just the oil that's in it, the chicken components and all that, that just so did not seem like a good idea. And nobody seemed to stand by hard numbers. Now, that said, I've got a couple packages because they're stupidly cheap, but I am going to, really, really look at that. I mean, I'm gonna very carefully, several years from now, if I had to use it, I'm gonna be very skeptical, very cautious in my examination of it. And I mean, it should pass the sniff test, and it doesn't have enough water in it to cause botulinum, so should be just a sniff and go product. And a lot of them are in, fairly airtight containers from, how you buy them. You might want to check. Some of them are just foil wrapped. I don't like that. But I will say, I mean, if you really are into bouillon cubes because you're like, what am I going to do with all this pasta, plain pasta? Well, let's at least put some broth in it, make a really crappy chicken soup without the chicken. Then just take the cubes and put them in a Mylar bag and oxygen absorber, and well, there you go. Not enough water for botulism, not enough oxygen for any other bacteria. Ta-da. So there is still a way, you just can't really do it in its original container or necessarily just like glass jars. Next up, fat-free powdered milk. This one is like a sort of forever. So here's the problem. Fat can spoil even if it's like powdered fat. Water can obviously spoil, so you need to remove both. So what they do is they make powdered milk that they somehow separated the fat out of as well. Still, even then, I'm being told 2 to 10 years is what you can expect. And that is a really wide range, and it's depending upon sorting quality, really. Which, how do you have any concept of that? Who knows how aggressively they sorted it? Who knows what kind of shelf life they were targeting? My guess is whatever it says on the can. Remember, the people making it, they do it as cheaply as they can. They don't overkill it just for the sake of overkilling it. And they don't advertise it as super long shelf life because some people will be like, oh, I'm paying more for that. And they wouldn't buy it. So they assume most customers will use their product in a realistic amount of time. So you really just can't trust it. In theory, if you get long-term stored powdered milk and they say, we made this in a way that will last 25 plus years, then you're good. But that stuff costs so much. You can mix it with water and mix it in with your coffee, though. So, I mean, hey, if you're really into milk, hey, go for it. It's a really decent source of protein, too. You just can't trust the off-the-shelf stuff. It's also really temperature sensitive. So not the easiest thing to store. Frozen, it lasts forever, but by forever, I mean until the power goes out. Next up, we got TVP, or textured vegetable proteins. It's a really dry compound. It's got usually some salt on it. It still requires an oxygen-free environment or refrigeration to be truly indefinite. But you can buy TVP and usually, keep it for quite a while. So people were saying, I think 2 to 5 years if it's not in an oxygen-free environment. So if you want to buy a TVP, put it in Mylar, oxygen absorb it, yeehaw, you should be able to get 20 plus years out of it. But, when I hear TVP, I'm like, oh, fake bacon bits. That's the number one product I can think of that's made with texturized vegetable proteins. But the problem is they come with a little bit of oil coating to make them feel like more, realistic bacon. So even that and the salt, and even being in a really airtight-ish Ziploc container from the factory, those still will not last long. In fact, they directly say refrigerate after opening because they know that exposure to bacteria is going to be a problem for that. So there's not many TVP products you could buy that would keep, and TVP itself, you really want to put it in an oxygen-free environment. So it almost made the list, but 2 to 5 years is not long enough for me. Next up, we got whole grains. This one may surprise you. This one is just out for pure inconsistency. Hard grains can last over a year in some enclosed but not oxygen-free environments, so a can, a jar, whatever, but they may not. They may partially spoil or they may not. I got mixed information from all different sources. It varies by type of whole grain. They're also just really rough to eat. Really, whole grains, what they do is they grind them up and make flour, like wheat flour and stuff. And the machinery to do that is, upwards of 200 plus from what I've seen. So, I mean, you can eat them, but boy, they don't taste good. You almost have to roast them first to make them to taste like something. You usually put them on the surface of bread, mostly as a decoration. It's just a bad food. I mean, yeah, whole grains intact, actual multi-grain, whole grain, whatever. It's good for your heart and stuff because of digestion and fiber, but in a survival environment, you don't really want fiber. So here's the thing. Most grains, because they contain, certain chemicals that just don't last, if you even put them in Mylar, vacuum sealed, jars with oxygen absorbers, whatever, they still only are reported to last for about 10 years. For comparison, just in the open air, just sitting out, like in a farmer's silo, you're lucky to get 6 months. The water content, water absorption, and like basically the internal oils are the problems. They're kind of like nuts. So they're just not a safe product to store. And the next one, and this one's going to be very controversial, is peanut butter. All I'm going to say is people keep spouting off, yeah, peanut butter lasts forever, and it's in a really thin, cheap, garbage plastic container every time. Very low quality plastic. So that's in itself a problem. The lid is cheap garbage plastic that will crack after it dries out a little bit in oxygen. And God help you if you get ultraviolet light on it. And then, well, you got different types of peanut butter. You got the highly processed, the not, the stuff with artificial, stuff added to it to make it thicker or thinner or smoother or creamier. And some of them, they even add like literally cream to it. There are varying levels of salt. I mean, at the end of the day, it's got oil. Oil is dangerous. The containers suck. Yes, there are some peanut butters that probably last forever. No, it's not even the majority of them from what it sounds like. So you go just buy some highly processed, extra creamy Skippy. It'll probably last longer than you think and past the expiration date, but it ain't going to go, 50 years. It's going to sort. The oil's going to be on the top unless, well, they use this type of oil. What if they added, saffron oil as opposed to vegetable oil? What if it's oil free? What if it's all natural? It's such a minefield. I mean, you can look into it and people will tell you, hey, I've had this on my shelf for 10 years and it worked. Cool. Go buy that. Hard to find accounts like that and if you really trust them. Some people say, yeah, I put it in a thing, pressure canned it. Yeah, it got hot, but who cares? Peanuts are heat stable. And now I've got pressure canned peanuts. So that's cool, but that's pressure canning. You can pressure can just about anything. I mean, if you really want peanut butter, you can get peanut butter powder that's been freeze dried. That's a lot safer. And that's from the companies that are like, yeah, we guarantee 20-year shelf life. That's how we did this. But anything short of that, I mean, I've got a couple jars of peanut butter. Then I started reading around about different results and can failures and all that. I'm like, oh, okay, well, at least it was cheap. And I'm trying to eat through it before its actual expiration date. So do not listen to the people saying that peanut butter is an automatic guaranteed choice. It is far from that. You might luck out. You might die. I'm going to skip it. And finally, it's butter, another kind of controversial one. The motto generally is stay away from butter. It doesn't matter if you're canning, if you're pressure canning, this, that, or the other thing. Everybody across the board just says butter is too dangerous. It's because of the water content. Butter in its natural form just has to have water in it, and that is just inherently unsafe. It is almost impossible to preserve butter. Even salted butter, there's still too much water and the salt can't kill everything. I've seen people canning butter and they said they never had a problem over exactly one season, and they felt like they were kind of pushed it even with that instead of mason jar. And I think they also probably boiled it, like they didn't just put it in there and call it a day. So they tried to kill all the bacteria within reason, but then you still got botulinum, but milk doesn't tend to interact with soil, but you never know. There's cross-contamination. Anything could happen. It's just so stupidly unsafe. Just don't do it. Don't go near butter. Now, if you really love butter, once again, basically freeze-dried powdered butter. That's freeze drying is the solution to everything. It is insanely expensive, and I was very unimpressed with the 10-year shelf life, which this is from a company where everything they have is 20 to 30, and powdered butter was still 10 because, well, remember what I said about powdered milk? They have to sort out the butter powder because it doesn't keep. So when you've got 10-year shelf life butter powder, how the heck do they do that? Butter is literally pure fat. So I'm sure, I'll take their word for it. It's a respectable company. I'm sure they got it up to 10 years, but 10 years isn't really that long. And get this, butter, how it's like one stick of butter is about 3,500 calories, I think, something like that. Yeah, this entire can that was over $30 only had 7,000 calories in it. So they must have done something to that fat. I don't know. That's, in my opinion, that's not even butter. I don't know what the heck they're doing. It might have synthetic butter additives to it or something, or butter flavoring. And I have no idea. For that price, the price to calorie ratio, if you're going to spend that big dollars on, long shelf life professionally made food, I'd go after just meat. Oh, and I think this company did make, they made peanut powder, but I think they actually made peanut butter that was shelf stable for 20 years. So if you talk to a company that's been in business for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years or something like that, and they say, yes, our products last this long. That's how we design them. Here's the technology that goes into our cans. Here's a picture of our facility and how we do it. They're really trying to establish hey, trust us. We know what we're doing. Those companies are great, but boy, are their products expensive. So if you have just unlimited money, yeah, just do it all that way. But otherwise, I think I've got an extensive list of really what I'm targeting with this video, which is the people on a limited budget, more realistic low budget. What can you just throw in an airtight jar, airtight container, and have last pretty much forever? And I think this is the list of every known food that can do that. I know the options are pretty narrow, but like I said, you definitely want to check out my Mylar food preservation video because it goes a little wider, and as soon as you start removing oxygen, you can store a lot more stuff for a lot longer. And as soon as I just come across $5,000, I'll be doing a freeze drying video, but there's a lot of like freeze drying channels on YouTube. Just go check them out. They're pretty impressive, actually. You watch what it started from, what it turns into in 24 hours, and then they rehydrate it, and you're like, oh my gosh, that looks like the real food. That's amazing. So if you got the time and you got the budget and you don't mind, putting everything in Mylar yourself and sealing it up in a fairly, sterile environment, then I say get the freeze dryer and then just make whatever food you want. A lot of people say they'll buy the freeze dryer and then they'll go to all the different grocery stores, or they'll have people who work there who will be like, hey, pork is like 75% off. We got all this pork. They're selling it by the 5 pounds and it's like 99 cents a pound, 70-80% off. Well, you buy up the whole, just a cart full of meat. You're basically carting up an entire pig at that point. I mean, clearance is clearance. You go at like 11 o'clock at night, nobody's going to say anything. Clearance, if it was limit 10 per person, they would have said something. Usually by the end of the day, they just don't give a crap. Or it's just the night staff not giving a crap. Or like me, and your friends all work the night shift at the grocery store, so they don't care what you do. So you buy it all up for like nothing, freeze dry it. It has like a 30-year shelf life, and then, you just cook it whenever your family wants meat, and it tastes just the same. Your kids won't even know if it's fresh or freeze dried because it's just so similar. It's such an amazing way of preserving food. And you could do just fruits, vegetables, meat. I mean, anything. You just throw it in, freeze dry it, usually 12, 24 hours, sometimes 36. Boom, it comes out. You got your full meal. It is truly, truly amazing. I will say, okay, they say, hey, the average family will save $1,000 in, spoiled food not going bad because you're like, oh, this is about to be its expiration date. Oh, this has been in the fridge for a week and we didn't cook it. Oh no, boom, threw it in the freeze dryer. You do save on spoilage, but I will say the amount of electricity used by this thing, it's significant. We're talking upwards of like $1 to $2 per cycle. And then you still got to pay for the Mylar. So it's like, yeah, that's, 20-some cents a bag, I think. So it's not as cheap as you think, but it's kind of that premium thing with the variety. So I just wanted to throw that in because that is like the ultimate food preservation method. That or, send it to the radiation blasting lab, which, don't. Although, you really want that jar of peanut butter to last, I'm just saying. So anyway, that is the full guide of foods that last forever, how, why, what to avoid, and what specifically to buy, and how it can go wrong, which is honestly the more important part than just some dumb list on some dumb website. Can you tell I strive to be better than the untrustworthy sources of information on survival and disaster preparedness stuff? And if you agree, leave a big old subscribe on the channel because I've got way more content coming out that could help save your life, or at least save you money. I'm hoping to do a lot more gear reviews, and spoiler alert, I got my hands on some 10-year-old freeze-dried food that we're going to do a little taste test of sometime soon. I think that'll be interesting. I don't know if anybody's really done that too much on YouTube. So anyway, share this informative video with anybody who, might find it relevant and important. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next video.